Hi everyone, welcome back to another video e-lesson for Hebrew Scriptures. I hope everyone's doing well and taking care of themselves. You've almost made it through a whole week of e-learning, so keep up the good work, right? And continue to just take care of yourselves and your family. And before you know it, we'll all be back together. I'm sure of it. I'm I'm doing well. Just working from home, and so is my wife. So that's nice. We get to stay home and work together. Um, so we're good, and I hope you are as well. A couple of notes before we get started with today's lesson. Um, so these videos is basically what would we be doing if we were sitting in class and I had to share some notes and materials with you, right? So, but just virtually. So, as we're going through these videos, right, it is your responsibility to be taking notes as you go through the video. Um, for more than anything else, when we have quizzes during this time as we're away, all our quizzes are going to be open note, right? So if you aren't taking the notes right now, and then when quiz day comes or a test comes, and you haven't been taking notes from these videos, you're gonna be in some trouble, right? You're gonna have to either figure something out or go back and watch all these videos, right? So you need to be taking these notes now. Um, Also, you need to be listening and paying attention throughout the entire video. And here's why. I have to take kind of air quotes attendance. And the way I am doing that is through your participation through these videos often. Not every day I'm not posting a video, um, but I have some sort of other activity or assignment where I can see your work and I can check you are participating for that day. Um, with these videos, um, throughout the video, I will ask you a question. Um, Today, I'm going to ask probably two or three different questions um, that will require you to answer in a private comment, right? And if you don't answer all the questions um, in a private comment for today, then you won't get the full participation points. And that's going to be reflected in your grade, okay? So you have to be listening and watching and paying attention throughout the entire video. Now is not the time to be trying to multitask, right? This is just as if we were sitting in class together, all right? And if you had other stuff out on your desk, phone and iPads or whatever, and you were doing other stuff while I was teaching, I would be saying the same thing right now, right? Um, so if you're doing other stuff while watching this video, you're going to miss it and you won't get the full participation points, all right? So that's all I want to say. So for today's lesson, we're continuing with, well, we should be able to finish the story of Joshua, um, and more specifically, um, as we talk about the Battle of Jericho. And our objective for today is to be able to identify the old covenant between God and the Israelites. And part of that covenant, right, is the Israelites receiving the promised land. Um, and their end of the agreement is they had to worship only God, right? And so we'll say more about that as we go through this lesson, okay? So let's begin. Um, I know this is a lot. Don't panic. And again, you have the luxury of being able to pause the video at any moment you wish to be able to, catch up in your notes and write down what you need to write down. Okay. But this slide right here, these are sort of the Spark Notes version of what's happening before the Battle of Jericho. This sort of set up the story for us. All right. So yesterday you watched VeggieTales. Um, it's a little different. There's definitely no slushies. Um, so the Israelites, they have just arrived in the Promised Land, right? Um, Moses is no longer with them, but Joshua is leading them. All right? And so they arrived, and Joshua sends 2 spies into the nearest city, which is Jericho. And so these spies, they, in the cover of darkness at nighttime, they go into uh, air quotes inn, because it's not really like a motel. It's a little more than that, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Um, but this inn is run by Rahab, who is a prostitute. Um, and a couple days ago, you read a little bit about Rahab and learned how she helps the Israelites, right? So this is what happens. Um, when the local king's men are they catch word about some spies in the city, they come to question her about any visitors she might have that's a typo, seen, um, and she hides them and then lies to the men. One of the weird times where lying is kind of the moral thing to do, right? She's protecting someone through this fib. So Rahab protects the Israelites, but then she kind of makes a deal with them, with these spies. She says, "I will help you escape if you promise that when you and your army attack Jericho, that me and my family, my people, will not be harmed in the battle." So here's your first question for you, and I want you to answer this in a private comment. Why is she concerned about her herself and her family being harmed in a battle? From what you read from the other day, um, and from what you know about sort of ancient warfare too, right? Why would she be concerned about that? Um, just give me your thoughts on that and your first private comment for today's lesson assignment posted on the classroom. Okay. And then she tells them she'll give a signal to them, and it'll be a red cord in her window. And here's sort of an artist's depiction of this scene. The only color in this drawing is that red cord, and you can see in the top right, Rahab is standing, and then she's hiding the 2 spies under her roof. Okay, a couple just quick points to wrap up sort of the setup for the Battle of Jericho. Um, as we talked about manna, this is how basically the Israelites survived wandering in the desert for 40 years. God provided manna, this bread from heaven, throughout that entire time, right? Now they're in a promised land. They don't need the manna anymore, so the manna disappears. Um, and then in the book of Joshua, there's this brief little scene where we see, and this was depicted in in VeggieTales too, right? Where Joshua is visited by the captain of the army of angels, right? Um, and all you really need to know from this little part of the story is, this is God, encouraging Joshua and the Israelites and letting them know that God will be with them in the battle of Jericho, that God will, protect them and be with them. Okay, let's read this passage together where we see the Battle of Jericho taking place. This comes from chapter 6 of the book of Joshua. Um, so, just follow along with me. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out, and no one went in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day You shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets. When they make a long blast with the ram's horn, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and all the people shall charge straight ahead. So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord. To the people he said, Go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord. So let's pause right there for a second. Couple of things. This is a weird way to fight a battle, marching around the city, right? We'll say more about that later. Secondly, there's a lot of stuff going on here with horns and trumpets, and specifically a ram's horn. Maybe or maybe not, some of you have heard of this before. This is called a shofar. It's spelled S-H-O-F-A-R, a shofar. So a shofar is just a ram's horn. And we see this used a lot throughout the story of the Israelites. This shofar is kind of used to announce the arrival of the people of God. And in this context, it's used to announce the start of a battle, right? Sometimes you see it in, I don't know if anyone's ever visited a Pentecostal church or a more charismatic church. Sometimes in the worship of that church, people will blow a ram's horn, and it's not a very pretty sound. So, for your second private comment for today's lesson, I want you to just write out, what is a shofar? I just laid it out for you. It's spelled S-H-O-F-A-R, shofar. Okay? Once you do that, you can pause it and do that, and then we're going to keep reading here. So, as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets. The rear guard came after the ark, while the trumpets blew continually. To the people, Joshua gave this command, You shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall you utter a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. So the ark of the Lord went around the city, circling it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord passed on, blowing the trumpets continually. The armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. On the second day, they marched around the city once and then returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. So let's pause there for a quick second. There is sort of a lot of repetition here. Maybe you've noticed. There's 7 priests. There's 7 trumpets. They're marching around the city of Jericho a total of 7 days. So, I'm sure you can probably guess, but what is the significance of that number 7 from what we've talked about this semester, right? Go all the way back to the beginning and the creation story. The 7 days of creation, and on the 7th day, the Lord rested, right? So this is very symbolic for the Israelites and for the author of this book who's telling this story, right? It's important for him to use this symbolism of 7, all right? Let's move on. On the 7th day, they rose early at dawn and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Again, 7. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and all who are with her and her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. Those are the spies. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction. so as not to covet, and take any of the devoted things, and make the camp of Israel an object for destruction, bringing trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. So, I'm going to pause right there for a second. This might be sort of unsettling to some of you reading this story. And believe me, this isn't even the worst of it. There are other passages where we see God's people basically doing, what a lot of people did in ancient warfare, which was slaughter and kill an entire city, men, women, young, and old, right? And it would appear that, when we're reading this, that this was God's command to do that. And that is sort of unsettling, right? And troubling. And I've talked about this with you a couple of times in class before. And I feel like this is important to take a moment to pause and clarify once more. As Christians and as Catholics, we hold the belief that Jesus Christ was fully God. He was fully human and fully God, right? And thus, the teaching and the message of Jesus is who God is. That's the most, the clearest reflection of who God is. It's very non-violent, loving, love your neighbor, love your enemy person, right? We don't really see that in this passage. And that's concerning. So how do we reconcile that? It's not an easy answer. But follow me on this. We believe that Jesus died on the cross non-violently, peacefully, right? He didn't fight back. He died for our sins. Jesus, God, allowed himself to be killed by humans, to save humans. The same sort of thing is happening here. We believe the Bible, it's inspired, right? Written by humans, but inspired by the Holy Spirit. But the same sort of thing is happening here, where God is allowing himself to be portrayed as a typical ancient God who is okay with this sort of thing happening, killing men and women, young and old. We know that's not who God's character is, but God allows himself to be portrayed like someone who is, so that he can stay in a relationship with the Israelites. If he didn't allow himself to do that, if he didn't allow himself to be portrayed by these ancient people as someone who's okay with, killing men and women like that, would the Israelites still be in a relationship with him and hold their covenant with him? We could argue probably not, right? So he has to allow himself to be portrayed like that. Just like he allowed himself on the cross to be killed by humans, to take the sin of humans on the cross, he's allowing people to put their sins kind of on him in this passage, if that makes any sense. Okay? So that he has the cross, the end goal is the cross in mind, right? So that he can one day get to that point. But he has to allow himself to be portrayed like this. I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but every time we come across some of these like troubling, sort of war passages, um, I feel the need to say that. Okay. If you have any questions about that, um, let's talk. Email me. Maybe we can set up a Google Hangout or something, and I can try to articulate what I'm trying to say better. All right. So let's move on. This passage is almost over. Joshua said to the two men who spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of it and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought all her kindred out and set them outside the camp of Israel. They burned down the city and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Joshua then pronounced this oath, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be anyone who tries to build this city, this Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest he shall set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So, just real briefly, even in this sort of last passage, this part of this passage, we see that the Israelites spare Rahab, a prostitute. And you have to think, sort of in the social hierarchy of ancient cultures, and even today, you know, are prostitutes looked at as well-respected people in society? Um, and there's that story in the Gospels of Jesus who saves the life of a prostitute, where Pharisees were about to stone a prostitute to death, and he steps in and says, "Let the first person who has not sinned be the first to cast a stone." Right? Um, Same sort of thing is happening right here. They're defending the prostitute. And coincidentally enough, the man's name is Joshua, and that is basically Jesus' name. We've kind of Englished-ized his name, but in Hebrew, Jesus' name is Yeshua. This is Yeshua. Both Yeshuas defend a prostitute. That's interesting. Mind blown, right? Okay, let's move on. All right, so we just kind of talked about this, but I want to make another point here, and you can just write this down. War and ethics. So the Israelites were given an order that they must destroy everything in this conquered town and take nothing for their own. And they do that with other cities and towns as well, right? Um, why? That is the question, right? And I kind of detailed my sort of explanation, um, but there's also a little more to it than that. So this is important to write down. It's also to prevent idol worship and other inappropriate Canaanite practices, such as temple prostitutes and child sacrifices. So, sort of one explanation is that, you know, it was important for them to destroy all the physical property of Jericho, including, you know, the false gods they worshipped and their false temples, where unfortunately this is very common in ancient religions, was to engage in temple prostitution and even child sacrifice. And actually, unfortunately, the temple prostitutes were often very young as well. Um, so this is sort of the ethics of the Israelites, even though they are still slaughtering people, and that's not great. But they are, they're holding themselves to a higher ancient ethic of, we know we are not going to, our God is different. We are not going to engage in this temple prostitution and the child sacrifices. That's not who our God is, right? So that's that first point. And the second is, this will be a continued theme throughout this unit, but the Israelites must totally trust God, right? They must fully rely on God. So here's a little artist depiction of a couple of the Battle of Jericho. On the bottom right there, you see the Israelites marching, and what do you think those horns are? They're playing. Those are the shofars, right? And then there's the Ark of the Covenant being carried. It just looks like a big chest. I said that before in class. It looks like a big treasure chest. Um, and then you see in the top left there the walls crumbling down, and I believe that's supposed to be Joshua there in the red and blue. Okay, the Battle of Jericho. Excuse me. So the Israelite army surrounded Jericho and they cut off all their supplies. That's very typical of ancient warfare. Um, then every morning for 6 days, they march around and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant and they blow their horns. And that's probably really annoying more than anything else. Um, then on the seventh day, they circled the city not just once but 7 times. That probably takes all day. And then they blow the shofars and the walls crumble and they shout, right? When they shout and then the walls crumble down. Jericho falls. And then Rahab and her family, her people, they're the only survivors, right? Joshua saves the prostitute. All right, we're almost done here. So they're finally in the promised land. Jericho was sort of the barrier to them fully being in the promised land. There'll be other battles and stuff, but they're in there now. And you have the 12 tribes of Israel, and they can finally settle in the land. And as we talked about before, you probably already remember this and know this, but the 12 tribes, they descend from Jacob's 12 sons, right? Over 1,000 years later, is it any coincidence that Jesus uses 12 disciples, 12 apostles? I think not, right? Because Jesus really saw himself as um, the representative of Israel. He's going to carry on the story of Israel and do what they couldn't do. So he used 12 apostles to symbolize the 12 tribes, right? Okay, so Joshua continues to lead the armies and fight and pillage and conquer parts of Canaan. Um, and once they basically clear out the land of um, all the people that were already living in there, again, this goes back to that manifest destiny we talked about. They felt they were entitled to their ancestral homeland. Um, and so they believed even that God was commanding them to kill these people, right? Um, so the land is divided among the 12 tribes, um, and they settle in there. And eventually Joshua dies, and he is buried in his ancestral tribal land. That's the end of the book of Joshua. So, here's a sort of final question I want us to think about. How should Joshua be remembered, right? Is he a hero? Was he someone faithful to God? Or was he someone who killed a lot of people? Um, I think, it helps to think about the story of the European settlers and the Native Americans in this land, right? How would they have looked at Christopher Columbus? A hero or a war criminal, right? So how should we remember Joshua? Someone faithful to God or someone who killed a lot of people? Or maybe a little both. I think there's room for maybe a little both. That's up to you to decide. And that's what I would like for you to do um, for your final part of this assignment for today and your last and I believe third private comment. You tell me in just 2 or 3 sentences. How should Joshua be remembered, in your opinion? And why? Should he be remembered as someone faithful to God? Explain why. Or someone who killed a lot of people? Explain why. Or both, right? Um, so those are your final instructions for today. Again, there are a total of 3 comments, private comments I'm expecting in order to receive your full participation points for today, okay? So make sure you get all those. Rewatch this video if you are like, oh, I only have 2 comments. I better go and find that third one, okay? If you have any questions, email me. Let's talk. I hope you're doing well, and I'll hear from you soon, okay? All right, goodbye.